So it's Monday, the 13th of July, and as you can probably see behind me, I've already started the structuring for part two. Um, Following on from last week's video, I haven't quite gotten the books to complete the research phase yet. And so I'm diving into part two because I've already got the material from the research ready to go. So um, today, Monday, I've spent about an hour or so going through at my pillar researcher for part two of the book, who is Robert Sapolsky, given his work in the book Behave, which is that one right there. Interesting thing about Behave, and the reason why Sapolsky will be my main expert that will provide the scaffolding framework and continuity throughout part two, which is going to be based around our biology, our neurobiology, and the very things that drive us as human beings, is because in Behave, he has an incredible framework where he looks at the causal links between all the various systems, if you will, that lead us to do the various things or behave in various ways. So he takes the view of, 1 second before a decision, 1 minute before a decision, all the way through to millions of years or tens of thousands of years prior to the decision, where that element of evolutionary biology comes in, as well as the cascade in the moment of stimulus that may be applied from us from the environment through to how the various functions within our body start to cascade, which ultimately then yields the behaviors that we observe. So I think he's got a brilliant framework to look at it. And I'm actually going to use that framework to tell the story in a more concise manner about how we behave that can then lead into why Bitcoin. So it's going to be a tailored view on it. And I'm going to bring in a few other perspectives that weren't necessarily in his book. So I'm starting with his work. And so I'm going to cut now to a bit of a time lapse of just seeing the process. Now, unfortunately, the camera screwed up on my connection to my Mac. I think the Mac kept powering off. I'm going into power saving mode during the filming. So I lost all of that initial footage. But I'll do a quick time lapse for half of that process so you can sort of see how I take the stack of cards and turn it into what's on the bed right now. So we'll cut to that. So this that we're now watching is me going through the stack of cards from Robert Sapolsky and the book Behave, and trying to order it in such a way that it aligns to the story that I'm trying to tell. When I was reading the book and initially taking the notes, it was very much a standalone exercise. I was just highlighting things that I thought were incredibly interesting, that loosely aligned to the premise of the book, that was trying to figure out how human behavior was being solved for by Bitcoin. But very much it was done in the dark. And so now going through the note cards does two things for me, which has been quite interesting. It allows me to review the cards again, and so it downloads the knowledge again to my mind, and it's making it a bit sharper. But as well, I'm able to do so into this more logically structured flow of the book. And already, as I was going through these cards, I started making connections that I didn't otherwise know. So as an example, there was some significant work that was done by Sapolsky in this book that links to Jonathan Haidt's work in morality, as well as to the left-right dichotomy in politics as well. And making these links, I can now see how that could be a good handoff point between part two and part three, because a lot of Jonathan Haidt's work will appear in part three. Other things in here which were interesting were the focus on culture and how that is being shone through Sapolsky's work, but that idea of culture and cultural evolution is a big one. So quick voiceover for this one here. It was a very interesting process. So I'll continue that through the week and just see where we land for part two. I can already see elements of even Sapolsky's work going into part one, very small amounts as it relates to economics, a few cards here, and obviously into part three that you heard in the voiceover. One of the elements that I didn't quite go through in the voiceover, which maybe I'll just quickly take this camera so you can sort of see the cards in a bit more detail. So here we go. What you'll notice is, and apologies for the lighting, these green cards up the top, represent various topics in the way that I currently see them. So from left to right, you saw EB, which is evolutionary biology, ideology, neurobiology, neurobehavior, behavior, culture, the seven deadly sins, this idea of hijack, how people can hijack our evolved systems to elicit certain behaviors, some things on economics, religion. You've got identity there, anecdotes that I think would be interesting, the us-them dichotomy, the left and right. I need to reconcile that with Jonathan Haidt, as you can sort of see there, and the neuro link to fight. And I've got some other just random cards that I'm not quite yet sure how I'm going to link it. But then you can also see here the next sets of cards I need to go through. So that was Evolutionary Biology by Richard Dawkins and Selfish Gene. Yuval Noah Harari in Sapiens. I've got Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. And I've got their David Sloan Wilson in Darwin's Cathedral. And there's actually a stack of cards missing here that relates to Jonathan Haidt's work in The Righteous Mind, which I think is under the psychology chapter, which I'll need to dig out as well. And that might form part of this. So I've got quite a few stacks to go. That there took me the better part of an hour and a bit, maybe 2 hours, just to go through, frame it for myself. That was my largest stack of cards. Sapolsky's work was amazing. It had just that many things that I kept on highlighting. And if you look through my book, you'll just see pages of highlighted text and this is distillation, whereas I got a bit less out of Richard Dawkins, given the context of the book that I'm writing. And there's actually a lot from Yuval Noah Harari, which is going to play on both sides as well. So my hope is by the end of this week, I've completed that process for each one of these authors and each one of the books that I've read that will relate to this part of the book, get a better sense for how all of these things are hanging together, and then start making some calls structurally about which stays in part 2 to keep to the intent of part 2, which is all about setting the foundations for our biology and behavior as a lead-in to the organismic view of Bitcoin and multi-level selection. So how do I build that foundation to be a natural handoff into part 3? So I'll make that, hopefully, that distinction this week as well, and then start to organize these cards, if I am that ambitious, into chapters. So how do I take all of these points and create coherent chapters that tell the story truly end to end? So that's the task for this week. We'll check in a little later in the week to see how we've been going. So today's Friday the 17th, end of the week, and the last update for this particular video that'll go out on Monday. 2 things to cover off today. First, I have made some significant progress on refining the structure of the entirety of the book. I think I've landed on how one part flows to the next, what's going to be included, and some new ideas on there, which I'll share with you. But first, to kick us off, research can restart again because I've got all the books that I need, which is this stack right here. So in order, and talking to the relevance of why these books to a degree, because I've already started reading a few of them. So this one here, The Bourgeois Equality, is by a economic researcher, professor called Deirdre Nansen McCloskey. Now, her work is quite significant already from what I'm already reading in the first part of this around my framing of part 1 on economic history in these 4 sections of the era of morality, the era of observation, the era of mathematics, and then the era of people or humanity. And she's already drawn a lot of those insights that I came up with independently, but ultimately she came up with decades ago on the explanation of economics. And so her credibility and her depth of knowledge and research is going to add a lot more weight to part 1 of economics, which is awesome. And also from her is the rhetoric of economics, and that title, Rhetoric, really talking to the ideas element that drives economy rather than just purely capitalism and trade. And so again, when I start to talk about cultural evolution as being a prime mover of economics, this one here also helps with the foundation although her book in bourgeois quality is the one that likely has the meat and potatoes of it. Outside of that, 3 other books where I'm not, before these books came, I was starting to read this one here, Nassim Taleb, Skin in the Game. This one's going to have quite an interesting interplay between evolution, the organismic view of Bitcoin, and as the title suggests, Skin in the Game is a way in which I can start to describe environmental pressures on an organism. So evolution would look at it that way. In the economic side of the fence, skin in the game is effectively that ability to feel the environmental pressures of the world around us as we think about economics and think about it as an evolutionary process. And he's got some great quotes and data points to help build that. So that one there, much smaller, thankfully, to get through that. The next one, again, it will be more towards the idea of morality to link parts 2 and part 3 of the book. It will build on Jonathan Haidt's work, especially if you've been reading my Substack. And if you haven't, just go there and subscribe. It is free of charge, and it is a more structured approach to my thinking about various aspects of the books as they arise in my thinking and writing journey. But this one here by Joseph Heinrich, The Weirdest People in the World. WEIRD being an acronym for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, but talks to a specific moral framework by which the West views the world, and it is a minority view. So understanding the morality of individuals and the communities that we build globally gives a different perspective on how we need to think about values and principles as it relates to Bitcoin, and it's a good handing off point between part 2 and part 3. And this one, I'm actually not too sure why. I went blindly from a recommendation from Gemini that this book would provide some rigor in some of the gaps that I've currently got in my justifications, which is Oded Gala, The Journey of Humanity. And I'll come back with what that book has. So those 5 are what I need to get through. Luckily, I'm not going to read the entirety of the bourgeois quality. This thing is a behemoth 700 page book. But there is a lot in here that more attacks or is more of a criticism of how we've approached economics in various aspects, which doesn't necessarily add to what I've already got. But part 1, part 4, and part 10 of this book are the sections specifically that talk to the framework that can be applied. So in order to get the structuring process underway and not stagnate myself too much, I'm just going to read parts 1, 4, and 10 out of this, roughly 200 pages or so, in order to get the insight that I need in order to start structuring. And then as I'm writing the section, I'll probably revisit some of the other parts in the book here. And luckily, these books here are largely 150, 200 page books, so they're not going to take me too long to get through. So that's the approach. Some rationale as to why I'm only going to be looking at certain parts at this point. One thing that I'm incredibly mindful of is that I can get into a paralysis state if I'm constantly going down rabbit holes and reading and researching without putting pen to paper. I can get stuck in this loop, and I could be in this loop for months. One thing that I realized when I was starting to read the first section of the bourgeois quality was a number of these aha moments happening as I'm reading sections of this where I can see it linking ideas that I had no idea how to link previously. She's articulated it quite well. And I could see the appeal of just constantly researching, realizing actually there's more I can know. But eventually you have to make the call as to when do you stop the research and start writing, and just update as you go so that you are making progress. Otherwise, I'm never going to release this book. And so I think I'm at that point where I need to make a hard call. I hope it's the right call. It may or may not be, but time will tell. But my gut sense is actually doing these couple of 200 pages here and there and completing that over the next 2 weeks doesn't slow me down too much on the structuring piece and allows me to get pen to paper and start writing so that I can get this book out at some point early in 2027. So that's on the research front. But the exciting part on the book structure front, what I've found actually from my process is taking time out and using the sauna, which I'm lucky to have on my deck and also in the shower, funnily enough, is where the ideas start to flow. For whatever reason, the heat of the sauna gets my mind thinking about the all of the abstract items that I've got in my mind from this research, and it somehow, some way, creates these meaningful links that then helps give structure to the book. And so in one of those sessions that I had this week, and I'm going to take the camera up here so that you can have a look at the whiteboard, it was phenomenal because I was able to now figure out how I was going to provide my own unique take on parts 1 to part 4. So with that, let's just take the camera over here. And apologies, it'll be shaky, and I might just put up a, I'll just put this up as a image now, but that is what came out of my head some point this week. So I'm going to go from actually top to bottom, left to right, so that you can see it. So image should be on the screen. In the top left, you've got what I've got now as part 2. And if you see these sort of two lines intersecting and then diverging again, I thought this was a great pictorial representation of evolution in Sapolsky's view, stretching back millions of years ago, and using Dawkins's view of the gene being the unit of selection in evolution, starting at the gene from millions of years ago and funneling down to this point in which all of these genes start to coalesce together into groups of genes, into chromosomes that then ultimately build the human body. He calls this the lumbering robot. And it comes to this sort of intersection where the brain starts to form as well. And then as the brain develops and we start to get the cognition element of our development that was with the frontal cortex, which is the third layer of the brain, you start to get this divergence of the creation of these new organisms as a result of cultural evolution. And so this left to right will provide a great pictorial representation of biological evolution coming to a point for humanity specifically, and then again blossoming out with far more organisms being created as a result of our frontal cortex and cognition in this idea of memetics and cultural evolution. That is, the technologies that our minds create, these organisms that we create, like Bitcoin, like religion, like political institutions, etc. And then that obviously then moves over to the right to culture, which is a huge pivot point and hinge point around my entire thesis. And that idea of culture comes through in Dawkins, in Jonathan Haidt, in David Sloan Wilson, and all the other evolutionists that I've done the research for, which is incredible. You then get to move in that cultural element towards part 3, which is this idea of looking at Bitcoin as an organism and drawing the parallels to religion, anchoring on David Sloan Wilson's work. So part 2 creates this incredible funnel and foundation to understand part 3 better. Here, I haven't quite broadened this out yet, but in that part 3, which is right underneath culture, I'll draw those parallels, and I do need to build that out. Which then, if you start going back up to the top, right next to part 2, you see part 1, social sciences, and the blank slate introduction. It was at this point that I realized that I needed to make this book like a recipe of a cake rather than individual ingredients. Because you don't care about just seeing the flour, seeing the egg, seeing the milk. What you want to see is how do all of these things come together to create something unique and delicious. In the idea of the book, it's about, I don't want these distinct structures of just economics, then a hard break, and then just biology, and then a hard break, and then just Bitcoin as an organism. I needed to combine all of these things meaningfully together in order to create this new narrative that was coherent, and not separate. So in part one, realizing this, the element that bridges this part one to part two is this idea of the blank slate. And so in Steven Pinker's book, where he talks about how the social sciences and ideology captured our civilization and introduced these three core concepts of the blank slate, the ghost in the machine, and the noble savage. These three doctrine underpinned a lot of the economic thinking in part one. But these three doctrine are completely at odds with our fundamental biology. And while Steven Pinker draws these parallels to destroy the blank slate with evolutionary biology, what I can do is in this retelling of economics show the mismatch between our biology and the way that which we built our structures that led to such poor outcomes and poor ways of thinking about economics. And then that leads nicely into part two. And so we introduce some biological, psychological elements in part one that are a natural thing into part two. And then in part two, that bridge then will be slightly different, which I'll talk to at the very bottom of this image. Now, finally, into part four is the so what? Why does this really matter for Bitcoin? Why do we need to look at it as an organism? Right now, I've got three key points that I want to land in this section at the moment, and it might broaden out a bit more as I start to go through it. The first there you can see is behavioral economics and not just Austrian economics. It's using parts one to part three to both diagnose the problem, put the individual back into focus in our economic models and economic thinking. And so from that, I see a need to really drive towards behavioral economics, not just Austrian economics as a Bitcoin community. And so again, it's a recommendation to open up the aperture of our economic thinking. Don't be dogmatically aligned to the Austrians, to the Hayeks, to the Mengers, the Mises, but broader into this new field of behavioral economics that has started to really burst to life in the 2000s. The second is principles based on the religion parallels. This idea here is we need to draw on history so that we do not repeat the mistakes of history. And since I've drawn the parallel between religion and Bitcoin as both organisms that have been evolving, Bitcoin is so young in the grand scheme of an organism. It is only roughly about, that 16, 17 years old, whereas religion has centuries of learnings that we can draw from. And so if we can draw the parallels between Bitcoin and religion as an organism, what are things that are likely to occur on this evolution journey of Bitcoin into the future that we can see parallels to in religion so that they can inform how we may approach those situations as they arise? What I think is going to be interesting here is I'm going to either in this section here or the previous one look at the block size wars as an evolutionary pressure that caused change. I'm probably going to do an analysis of the BIP 110 core versus not debate that's currently occurring in the ecosystem as another parallel of evolutionary pressure, and how religious principles may impact that. The third one is culture. So this is institutions. If we agree that Bitcoin is a cultural organism, then therefore we can draw parallels to other cultural creations of the human mind. And in this case, those institutions that I really want to focus on are education, health, and politics. But again, draws this linkage between if Bitcoin is for money and it is a cultural evolution and the first of its kind of the digital world, then it then warrants us to apply this to non-monetary institutions or cultural innovations of the human mind, and they are education, health, and politics, and to broaden the problem that we're trying to solve. And then there's four, I said TBD. So that's the idea for part four as a starting point. A lot to work to do there. And then finally, at the very bottom of this, you've sort of got a part one to part four, who my anchor expert is. But what I've added here is the bridge between the sections. So in part one, I've got McCloskey, who is the author of The Bourgeois Equality, which we spoke to just earlier. But the link here is actually Steven Pinker in his work in The Blank Slate that will appear in both part one and part two. We then anchored to Sapolsky, who will provide that holistic end-to-end view of evolution all the way through to neurobiology. But the link between part two and part three is Jonathan Haidt and Yuval Noah Harari, who bring the cultural and moral aspects that then have a nice lead in to David Sloan Wilson's view on religion as an organism and therefore Bitcoin as an organism. And then finally, we see this bridge between part three and part four. It's not just all, but I've got this idea of using Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who were psychologists and arguably the forefathers of behavioral economics, including Richard Thaler. But their ideas of bridging psychology and economics together is what's leading to then the next, the first of my recommendations in part four being that we need to have a view on behavioral economics, but really drawing from the fact that we are culturally mismatched, that we are irrational people, and that these cultural institutions and innovations are there to tackle them. So that's very kind of just sort of coming back here. So that was the breakthrough this week. And I think the great thing about this breakthrough for me at the moment is it's given me real clarity now on how to structure each part, but also how to structure the subchapters. And now that I have the points on the subchapters within each part, I can start to look at my note cards that you saw at the very start of the week on my process of putting them into themes. I'm already rethinking some of those themes against some of these chapters to land the points. And because I've got that clarity now, the structuring process should go a lot faster. What I plan to do next and into next week is to, just plugging in the camera because it's about to die. What I'm planning to do next is do the reading, but I don't want to slow down on the book structuring. And so I think what I'm going to do next is start to break down each one of these parts into their key points to land what I just walked through. And then by landing those points that need to be made in order to justify my perspective, it will determine the chapters. Because I think one of the ideas that I'm working with around how do I build out this book is each point that I need to make needs to have its own chapter. And so by defining the points that are required to justify a position, I automatically determine what my chapters are. And then I can go to the next level, which is what justifications do I need to land those points? And then that's where I go and draw from the cards to say, okay, if in this section I need to land elements of ideology, elements of the mismatch of biology versus the world around us, elements of whatever it might be, I know which author I need to go to and how to bring it together into that chapter. And given that I know who my expert is, I know how it needs to be framed. So a lot more clarity now as well, but I'm actually quite happy now with this structure as a starting point. I expect it to change a little bit. Hopefully not too much from here because leading up to this point in my gut would tell me that I didn't have the structure cracked. I could just tell there was something missing. My gut is telling me that I'm 90% there now with the structure and the approach, and now it's just refinement. So I'm expecting it to be refined, not to drastically change, but you never know. Keep an open mind because I might come up with something else in the sauna next time. So very long update on this particular video. I'm just seeing it's over 20 minutes. But if you've reached this part of the video, my God, I'm surprised that you're with me for this long. So thank you for staying this long. You're just seeing a stream of consciousness out of my mind. As I said before, I think that this channel and these videos are there for me actually just to talk to the camera, because even talking through it and being able to articulate it and practicing it in itself is part of the process for me for writing this book. So regardless if people watch this, doesn't really matter. It would be nice if you did, but it doesn't matter to me at this point. it is just an incredible tool for me to talk through it out loud, and by doing so, land the points in my mind better. So that's it for this week. Thank you if you've watched to this point. If you haven't already, please like, share, subscribe, all the traditional things. I do want to build an audience so that when the book does get released, those that have enjoyed the journey, interested in the ideas, hopefully will become buyers of the book. That's the intent of this journey here, to document it, to get people interested and excited about it. So absolutely, if you can share it, that would be amazing. Until next time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.